Dunning was cold. It was always cold, but tonight the cold was biting. Rolling winds passed through the renovated city from the flat, overpopulated fields and past the concrete giants that had been built over the small houses that had once made up the town, howling as they went. Even with all of the technological advancements that had been made in the past 9 decades, all of the hovering cars, automated drones, and neon-colored lights, it was still almost impossible to keep a cold wind from slipping into a jacket. From the 25-story rooftop where Sentia stood, those winds were even worse, and she shivered, hugging her upper torso's ribs as she waited for the big moment, the moment to end it all. Tonight would be her last time working these crazy gigs. She could take her cash and go somewhere new, start something new. While normally that thought would have warmed her to her core, nothing she did managed to fend off the cold, and she groaned in disapproval. She'd worn a solid jacket, a set of heavy wolf furs, and had even gone out of her way to put on leg warmers, yet she was still cold. She was thinking happy thoughts, and yet she was still cold. She could only hope that things would warm up when the action started. Looking over the roof, past the skylights, she surveyed her surroundings. Light flooded Dunning, making it harder to see into the night than any amount of natural dark could. Multiple sky-piercing buildings surrounded her in all directions, the streets below shimmering with car lights, street lights, and various store signs. The little specks that were the populace moved and bustled, going about whatever occupied their little lives below. The city was alive and huge, as all post-ignition cities were. Every city was comprised of people scrambling for space and safety in numbers, as giant, mutated monsters, superhuman cyborgs, and souped-up megalomaniacs threatened to kill, enslave, or make them homeless. Small towns like the pre-ignition Dunning wouldn't have lasted a day with the kind of creatures and fiends that plagued the surrounding wilds. Dunning, as it was, played host to 21 million sapient citizens, all packed together in a 700-square-mile radius. Each of those people was struggling to live, fighting daily against the elements and one another. To fit that many people together in such a small space, with monsters roaming around the borders, picking off anything that wasn't bigger and meaner than they were, you needed to build smart, build efficient, and build up. That's what the people had done. Sentia was told that the post-ignition rush to build new homes had been one of the few times in history that humanity had banded together, even when people started growing extra limbs and fur. The ignition, a world-changing event that had dragged magic into a world that had been without it, had brought about more than just spellcasters and pretty new homes to live in. The event had begun an evolution of sapient life on the planet. Mana saturation had spurred on changes to mankind on a genetic level. Men and women began mutating, their bodies shifting to handle all of the foreign energy now housed in their cells. New species were born over the course of a decade. Magic had brought with it the existence of shifters, beatsmen, devils, angels, dragons, and in Sentia's unique case, centaurs. Each new race had quirks and diversity just as wide as the humans before them, and, oddly enough, humans themselves dwindled in number to an almost pitiable amount, nearly 10,000 in existence in PI 92, their numbers replaced as men and women transformed into new beings. One such being was Sentia's spotter for the night, a plucky little goblin named Faz. He was short for human standards, standing at a solid 4'3", but as a centaur he didn't even really come all the way up to her underside. His wild, shoulder-length black hair flapped about in the wind around his several-inch-long green ears. His face, while charming in a classical sense, was set in an annoyed scowl as he tried to squint to pick up on people across the street in the building where their target was set to show. "Any sign?" she asked, her tone hopeful as she glanced down at her weapon. Her gun was taller than the man, and that thought amused her to no end. It was a beautiful, heavy-duty piece, something she'd had made custom for her when she'd got into the business of enforcing for the Dunning Black Cats 10 years ago. It looked like a mix between an anti-tank rifle and a glaive, mainly because it was. Old Man Grant, as she called it, was meant to operate on all parts of the battlefield so that she could move from range to up close without having to over-adjust. For any creature weaker than a minotaur, the weapon wouldn't work, having to be propped up on a bipod and abandoned up close because of its weight. For her, it could be fired on the move and pack enough punch to stop a charging plated juggernaut.
Not a damn one,
her watch companion spat, popping a box of cigarettes from his pocket along with a lighter. Sencha's brow raised as she watched him take one from the box, place the cigarette to his lips, and drag as he lit it. With how expensive the little things were, it was a wonder he'd take one now, rather than saving it as a post-job treat. She didn't comment on it, though, her eyes moving back to the other building. The party for Cedric Valinov's 112th birthday was an auspicious occasion. The entire roof and top floor of the neighboring building had been renovated to facilitate the wealthy man's party, cinematic celebrities, high-class women, and big underworld names all showing up to congratulate Valinov on his long life. The Valinov family was one of the few lines west of the North Atlantic to have surviving family past the ignition. Something about their genetics had lent them to very long lives, their oldest known living relative being over 150. Scanning the swaths of beast folk, shifters, orcs, and gobs at his party, Sencha didn't see the man either, and huffed, rubbing her sides more insistently in the hopes of driving up her own body heat. Shifting from hoof to hoof, the centaur tried to get her thoughts together as she monitored the party. "He could be on time for his own damn party," she grumbled, her body stiff from the long wait. "How are you not freezing, Faz? You weigh like 75 soaking wet. I'm up here losing circulation."
Well, for one thing, I have better circulation than your fat horse ass. Don't need 2 hearts to keep the blood moving,
he replied, smoke billowing from his maw in messy gouts as he spoke, only to be carried off on the wind. "Well, fuck you too for that," Sencha snarked, rolling her eyes.
Not kidding.
He chuckled with her for a moment, glancing her way, though he perked up a half-second later and flicked the cig away. What a waste.
Enough bullshit. Get ready to move. Mark dead ahead.
Sencha set to motion without pause, catching the urgency in his voice. Stooping to pick up Grant and sling his strap over her shoulder as she readied for the jump, she glanced across the gap between buildings to spy a long, serpentine man pulling himself out of a stairwell and onto the roof. Once the thick leather was rested securely around her for the leap, she reached out and took Faz's forearm in her hand, tossing him up onto her back as she turned and cantered to the other side of the roof they were on to prepare her running start. Once there, she shouldered the rifle, took aim at the opposing roof, and took a deep breath. This was the last moment of calm she'd likely have for days to come. 3 of 4, right? She asked, more for the sake of calming her nerves than anything else, as she felt tension welling in her chest. The cold air clung to her lungs and numbed her cheeks as she once again glanced out at the city.
Right. 4 of 4 is better. Take the head, and we can hopefully get all 3 hearts while we're up there,
he barked as he clung to Sencha's waist. Normally, she wouldn't let anyone sit on her back like he was, but with what was about to happen, she made an exception. It wasn't likely he'd tell anyone anyway. Doing a quick roundabout, the Taurus turned and set into a hard gallop, keeping the bayonet on the end of her rifle low as the edge of the roof closed in for an instant. The wind roared in her ears, setting her long black tresses flying behind her as she forced her way forward. Large as she was, this was barely enough space to get the running start necessary for such a leap, but she did, raising the muzzle as her forehooves hit the edge, and she pushed off. She raised the muzzle, her eyes locking on the head of the 30-foot-long serpentine birthday boy as he wrapped his hands around the much smaller hand of a cute little blonde shifter with curly locks. His smile was practiced, charming, joyful. Her hind hooves hit the ledge, and Sencha launched herself into the air. The world around her seemed to slow down as she raised the rifle to properly aim as she flew. "Happy birthday," she mumbled, the ironic well-wish floating away on the wind before it was completely drowned by the bark of an armor-piercing round passing from the muzzle and completely vaporizing Cedric's head. People didn't even have time to start screaming as Sencha cleared the 40-foot gap between roofs, landing hard enough to crack the concrete and continue her gallop. Only when she'd trampled and run through over half of the party, doubtlessly injuring countless innocents, did she hear the uproar really start, people screaming and beginning to dive out of the way. The young blonde who had been holding hands with Valinov was in shock, too much so to even fully parse that the man she'd been talking to was dead. She was lucky one of the other guests had dragged her out of the way by the time Sencha got to the corpse. As she observed, she saw that the neck was already pulsing, trying to regenerate the head that the man had just lost. Rather than deal with that, she ran his humanoid torso through with the first 3 feet of her bayonet, piercing his heart easily with Old Man Grant. From her back, the much yappier bark of Faz's pistol rang out, followed by even more screams as the man on her bayonet twitched and began to writhe. From his open throat, a wet gurgle came as the creature attempted to continue living, even without its head and one of its hearts impaled, the other 2 run through with pistol rounds. From further down in the building, shouts and alarms had already begun, loud enough to be heard past the bouncing dance music below. She saw people starting to rush up the stairs the birthday boy had originally come from. Rather than deal with a slew of guards trying to surround them, Sencha exerted some of her considerable strength to lift the corpse on the end of her weapon, holding the body aloft as a shield as she charged the stairwell.
Sen, what the fuck are you?
The gob hissed as he let off another few rounds across the body of the snake man. He was cut off by the roar of gunfire from below them as dozens of bullets rained into Cedric's still-living body, some punching through. Luckily, the sudden flare of pain in Sencha's side was merely a graze. She charged to the top of the stairs with the body in tow, pushing it until she felt the resistance of someone behind him pushing back at her, and saw a muzzle beginning to round the body. Then she fired again. There was no space to dodge, no warning for the guards trying to climb the stairs. The bullet passed right through Cedric, exposing his torso as it passed, and shredding a uniform red hole through each of the numerous guards trying to make it up the stairs, felling each of them, and causing those at the bottom to scream and disperse. Fairly certain not even a Valinov could regenerate from that much bodily damage, Sencha charged down the stairs into the party, much to the protestation of her passenger. She growled in displeasure as she found some of the guards had managed to avoid getting blasted in her second shot. As her hooves smashed the tiles on the stairs, she charged into the floor, thankful the building was standard 15-foot story rather than the old-school 10-foot, which would have made it impossible to maneuver. Instead of shooting again and blasting large holes into the party, she managed the bayonet on the end of Grant, leveraging the dangerous polearm into a wide swing and bisecting 2 of the nearby men as she hit the landing. She was thankful to hear another series of frantic shots from Faz's pistol as she charged the floor to make her second roundabout and get out of the building. She was confident that the cover fire had kept any number of holes from being put into her hide as she trampled tables full of refreshments and unsuspecting partygoers. Yet all too soon she was charging back through the place towards the large reinforced windows, her weapon leveled at the glass. Reinforced as it was still no match for a weapon of Grant's caliber, and with a bark and a deafening crash, it shattered, leaving enough space for Sencha to leap through the gaping window and into the night, over to the next roof. As her hooves slammed into the concrete, jarring her bones with the massive impact, the centaur didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't even slow. The chase was on. The main objective had been accomplished. The job was not over. Not until the escape. The elevator down to the main floor of the building Sencha had landed on played slow, smooth music that made women picture someone in a large armchair sliding down until their back was on the seat. It was a silly image that made her smirk. She also found herself pleased that the sting had indeed warmed her up. All of the running and shooting had really gotten her blood pumping. She certainly wasn't hot, but she no longer felt like she'd catch a case of the shivers. Beside her, Faze eyed the numbers on the pad as they slowly went down. 15. 14. Nice shooting back there, Sencha volunteered, checking her light flesh wound on her side from where she'd been shot on the roof. Her bleeding looked far worse than it was, warm, sticky scarlet mixed with the furs she wore. Having been shot before, she could tell without a serious check that this was a mere annoyance, something to be ignored, another damned scar.
You too. It's always a treat to watch you pop a melon.
He chuckled, looking away from the panel and up at her. His eyes lingered for a while before he spoke again.
Gonna either be clear out there or a bitch and a half,
he said, stating the obvious. He looked into her chocolate-brown eyes, seemingly searching for something. Either way, the drop points are the same, she said, shrugging. Gotta hit those gates and slide on past. Once we hit the tree line, I've got us to a safe spot. Whatever he heard in her voice or her declaration seemed to be what he was looking for. Ejecting his mag and slapping it into his back pocket, he racked the slide to eject the chamber round and caught it in a smooth motion before slapping in one of 3 fresh magazines he had left. Finishing a quick barrel check and the like, he racked his slide again and nodded to himself. His check prompted Sensha to look at her own packs. Her saddlebags were stuffed for travel, road rations, water, and several spare mags settled to her back and rear thighs. It was enough supplies to make it to the next city over, and then some. 7. Sounds outside of the elevator were muted, the music and shelling of the lift making it feel like the pair were locked in their own little world. In the moments before those 2 double doors opened, time seemed to slow, to drag on for seconds into hours. Sensha took a deep breath, her hair standing as she felt the momentum building, pushing at the gates. Something was going to happen. She just knew it. 2. Hop on. We're making a break, she decided. The tension was ready to burst. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. Something was wrong. She reached out to Faz, who nodded and took her hand. Well, she took his arm, but that's semantics. She yanked him onto her back as they heard the ding. Her intuition had been wrong. There was no one waiting for them in the foyer. She charged out of the building, ready to take and return fire, only to find no one prepared for them in the street. However, her erratic, explosive movements drew attention. From across the street, a group of goons in suits spotted her and began shouting.
That's them! It's the fucking horse!
The centaur and the goblin shared a look, knowing that their play had just caused them a lot more trouble than playing it cool might have.
Shit!
They both groaned before Sensha turned, kicking into a full gallop down the main street.
I'm never trusting your stupid horse intuition again!
Faz shouted at her as the wind whistled past his ears, the squeal of tires distant for the moment. The 2 knew better than to think motor vehicles wouldn't catch up to them in time. Less talk, more useful plan, she shouted back at him. The clack of Sensha's hooves on tattered, shambled pavement that was old Route 91 was the only sounds to be heard as she continued her run to the drop-off point. Escaping the detail of hired goons that had chased them out of the city had been a near thing, and the centaur and her spotter both sported fresh wounds from the chase. Even with their backup ambush in the city, Sensha had barely escaped city limits with her life. Now the pair were 4 miles out from the walls, trotting to the safe spot. Faz still clung to her, his breaths just as ragged as hers, even though he hadn't done even a fraction of the running. Near-death experiences had that effect on men and women. The 2 hadn't spoken since they left the gates either, just trying to keep themselves breathing. When Sensha saw the spot where she'd be parting ways with Faz, though, she did speak. Okay, here's your stop, bud. We've got a guy on his way out here to pick you up. Then you're back to Dunning with new duds, Sensha said between her ragged pants.
Me? Where the fuck else are you going?
The goblin asked, looking over her as he pulled away from her, her back still warm where his chest and face had been pressed the whole time. Dunno. Anywhere's better than here, she said, sighing as she slowed from her trot to a light canter, making her way to the drop. And unlike you, my diminutive friend, I'm not good at keeping a low profile. Not a lot of centaurs in Dunning. Best I find somewhere else.
And you were going to tell me this when?
He asked, his voice dangerously low. Now? Sensha said as she slowed further, only to receive a brisk smack to the back of her head. Ouch!
You fucking dunce. Did you think I wouldn't want to know?
I figured you wouldn't care much. Fuck, she said, turning and holding a hand to keep her head safe as the irate gob smacked her on the back again. Not like we've ever been all buddy-buddy.
That's not an excuse, you damn dumb fucking horse,
he shouted, assailing her with a flurry of tiny green-fisted blows.
We've been working together for over 3 fucking years. You'd think I'd get a 2-week fucking notice that you were quitting.
Sencha turned, trying to get the angry little man off her at this point. Ouch! Ow! I'm sorry. Sorry. Sheesh, she cried, trying to pacify the spotter, until finally he hopped off her, obviously still angry. Shit, man. I didn't want to piss you off. I just wanted to leave quiet, she said, looking down at her former partner in crime. I'm sorry. Genuinely, Faz. I'm sorry. I didn't really think it would mean much to you. We barely talk. While we worked together, you were my best partner. No one came close. I couldn't have gotten here without you, but I'm out. I don't want this anymore. I want a house, a girlfriend, some fucking security. I'm tired of chasing down screaming asshats and blowing holes in them. I'm tired of running from armored vehicles and pulling off near-death escapes. I want things to be quiet. The goblin paused at that. He still seemed angry, still seemed way more hurt than she'd ever expected him to be, but he also seemed like he'd hurt her. Sencha stepped forward, her smile hopeful and pleading. She just needed him to understand, knew it would all be okay if she could just get through. One more push to get through. It must have been a result of her own exceptional weight, but she heard something groan beneath them as she shifted her weight. She looked down, and that action alone probably saved her life. The whiz of a bullet passing over just where her head had been made her quick to move. Unfortunately, the ground began to give away. Faz reached out, his arm outstretched as he tried to help her. Then his torso vaporized. Pain bloomed in Sencha's right foreleg, and then the ground beneath her exploded and collapsed. The last thing she saw as she tumbled into the dark below was the arms of her dead spotter, tumbling and twisting through the air above her. A girl sat at the bar, her legs crossed, as she leaned against the polished counter and fiddled with her mojito. Her wild, poofy red curls drifted lazily across her field of vision as she peered into the minty, lime-garnished refreshment. She'd been waiting for a quarter hour to meet with the detective, and she couldn't say that the wait wasn't making her antsy. She could think of a great many things she'd rather be doing than sitting at the bar. When a large hand settled against her waist, sliding forward to press fingers against her silky skin, she jumped a little, surprised. "Oh, detective, I didn't know it was this kind of meat," she began, until she noticed that the fingers pressed to her exposed midriff were not clawed. Looking down, her eyes widened as she noticed deep-tanned, thick fingers she recognized.
"Hey, Cha. Good to see you again,"
came the rumbling, deep voice of her ex-boyfriend, Tabernus, his heated breath washing across her neck in a way that made her lean into his grip. He was familiar with her and to her, his hand squeezing just right as she barely managed to stifle her reaction to him. "Tab, been a while," she gasped, leaning away from him and further into the counter, as she turned her head and looked up, past her curls and into twinkling green eyes. The sharp-chinned, square-jawed grin that greeted her was one she was all too familiar with. Her eyes roamed over his red skin, up to the black horns that protruded from his brow and swept back along his sleek, shiny ravenlock wings. Tabernus was a sharp, powerful-looking devil as always. His broad, rounded shoulders and thick arms made his size all the more apparent. "I see you've been working out," she commented as she placed a comparatively little hand on the arm he had around her, gently pushing it to hint that she didn't want him holding her. The gesture only managed to stroke his ego along with the statement as she found her hand dwarfed by his bicep. Looking from that arm to the defined barrel chest barely hidden by his stretched Songs of Night tee, she remembered very vividly why she'd been attracted at the beginning of their relationship. What has it been? A year?
18 months.
He replied easily, his smile not wavering as he continued to hold her, his hand shifting possessively down to her wide hips, where he settled it. With him standing over her at the bar, he completely dwarfed her, his stature and musculature obscuring her from the view of the majority of the bar.
And you've been on my mind for all of them.
She averted her gaze, trying not to let his words get to her. Tab was charming, large, powerful, and jealous. He was all of the many things she really wanted in a man. He also wasn't good for her. She knew this very well after years of on and off dating. I'm flattered, Tab. Really I am. I have a meeting tonight, though, she said, keeping her eyes off his. She didn't want to be caught up in him. She knew him well enough. He wouldn't glamour her into doing what he wanted. He wouldn't force his magic on her. But he didn't need magic to get her lost in his eyes. Just as she had that thought, she felt him move and knew she had somehow jinxed it. He caught her chin easily between his thumb and forefinger, drawing her face and her gaze back where he wanted it, wanted her. And just like that, she was lost, wandering forests of beautiful, lush green. She felt his grip on her shift, his fingers and palm cradling her face, his thumb brushing suggestively over the plump pout of her lower lip. Her lips parted at the suggestion as he drew closer. She put up her hand, placing it on his chest, but it did nothing to stop him, nothing to dissuade him, not even for a second. She could feel his heat on her lips again, feel his grip on her tightening as he readied himself to take her. Came the gruff clearing of a man's throat.
Mocha te batsu.
The interruption shattered the moment for both of the ex-lovers. Tabernas frowned and took his eyes off her, turning to see who had spoken, and she managed to pull free of his palm, turning on her stool to look at the newcomer. Both of their gazes fell on the handsome muzzle of a tall, lichen man in a lengthy gray coat, covering what the girl could only assume was a uniform. He seemed on the older side of the boat to Mocha, maybe in his late 40s.
Who are you?
Tabernas asked, his tone dark as he stood to his full, daunting 7-foot height, looming far over the heads of everyone else in the bar. He flexed, his body bulking as he glared down at the wolf. Mocha knew if she didn't step in, things would get out of hand really quickly.
I'm Detective Darren J. Molnar, Neo-Denver PD Detective First Class. Mr. Henderson?
The man said calmly, raising one of his brows in bemused interest.
Sorry to interrupt your conversation, but Mocha and I have a meeting, and I'm a bit late, so we're short on time.
Tab looked between Mocha and the man, and then back to Mocha, leaning in on her, his hand resting on the counter to block her off from the wolf's view.
I'll catch you later, Cha. Don't get too friendly while I'm gone,
he said, before turning and walking off, pushing a smaller man out of the way as he headed toward a side exit to the tavern. Mocha looked after him, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide as she slowly mastered herself, sighing and turning to meet the detective. Hey, sorry about that, Detective Molnar, she said, sure to exude apologetic intent in her words and demeanor as she held out a dainty hand to shake. I didn't expect Tabernas to show up.
Not a problem,
the detective replied, reaching out and taking her hand in his paw, his claw-tipped fingers wrapping around her hand to give a firm shake.
Boyfriend, I take it?
He asked, looking to the door the man had just exited through. Ex, she corrected, looking away embarrassed.
His choice or yours?
The wolf asked, digging into the topic. Mine, she said, looking up and frowning as they disengaged hands. He seemed to catch her discomfort, and his ears pinned back as he apologized.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry. It's part of my job to dig for information, and I have a bad habit of doing it outside of work, too.
He said, his tone sheepish and apologetic.
Let's focus on the topic at hand.
Sitting at the bar, the wolf snapped to get the waiter's attention.
Stout. And some chips, son. Second round for my friend while you're at it.
He growled, and the tender nodded, moving to the order. Mocha raised an eyebrow, recrossing her legs as she observed the man's display. Either he was familiar with the bar, or he was used to being bossy. Either way, she wasn't particularly impressed, but she listened as he started talking.
We don't normally take up civilian contracts, as you were likely guessing. But this isn't a standard case.
He started off, taking up his stout as Mocha returned to her mojito, sipping the refreshing beverage through a straw with a slight nod, stifling her urge to appreciate its flavor audibly.
This witness has provided substantial proof that they have a lead on the origin of the ignition, or at least details on the organization nearest to discovering its location,
he continued, leaning in only slightly to remain inconspicuous. Mocha nearly dropped her glass, eyes widening as she processed what she just heard. The ignition was an event that had happened decades before her birth. A massive surge of energy, now known as mana, had bled into the earth, splitting continents as it caused new growth, new life, and mutations to form on the surface of the planet. A world once devoid of magic was now flooded with the stuff. The influx of mana had changed the way the world worked. People who were powerless suddenly became super-powered monsters. Timid recluses stepped out into the light of day with draconic powers and an appetite for flesh. The world as humanity had known it changed overnight, and when the blood had settled and new leadership had taken the earth by storm, life had continued, as it always did. What the detective was saying was that whomever this witness was had some clue or valid hint on a way to find the place where everything began, the core of magic on the planet. Finding that nexus of magical power, making contact with it, there was no telling what exactly such a thing would do. Mocha was very interested in this information as well, though even knowing it, she still found herself perplexed. "Okay, let's say I believe you," Cha proposed, putting her drink down on the table as the tender set down her fresh drink, leaving both glasses for her to enjoy at her leisure. "I'm an arms dealer. I make weapons. You and your chiefs know this. Why are you hiring me? This is a matter of She caught herself before she screwed up and used some choice words that would get her in trouble. "This is a high clearance, need-to-know kind of thing, isn't it?" The wolf looked at her with an approving smirk, his eyes betraying how pleased he was that she'd caught on.
We're hiring you because the witness specifically requested that you be their liaison when dealing with the PD, otherwise they'll be withholding the information.
He explained, his tone even, and his eyes seeming to search hers for any information. Mocha's eyes widened at his explanation, her confusion evident on her face. "They asked for me?"
Yes. They said you were the only person they would trust with the information.
"Okay. I take it we're negotiating pay, then," Mocha said, switching the topic to give herself a little time to process that information. Who did she know and trust well enough that they would trust her with matters of global security? Who among her many contacts would pick her out of all people to confide in? She couldn't think of anyone.
We're willing to salary you a solid 500 large, with an additional 250 to agree. The money's yours, regardless of the length of their stay, so long as we can get that information,"
the man said, calm as ever. It was mildly unnerving for Mocha to see someone so unaffected by the circumstances surrounding them. Had she been in his position, she would have been dying of curiosity, yet he sat before her, unabashed, unperturbed, and uninterested. "I take it this means I can expect cooperation from the police with regards to their housing and needs?" she asked the detective, looking at him with a grim seriousness on her face. She was not willing to let them turn what money they promised to pay her into a stipend for babysitting. She wanted that money, and she wanted it for keeps.
"Of course. We're offering our full support during their time with you."
He nodded, the gravel never really leaving his voice. The detective seemed like a man who was regularly rough on his larynx. As his strips of fried potato arrived, she sighed and had a look around herself and around the bar. Most of the people in the tavern wouldn't fit the description of shady, most simply looking like regular civilians. Some wore long coats, but they sat in very open positions, showing off their bodies as they wined and dined with their companions. She didn't know where the backup officer was, though she knew no detective in Neo-Denver would do such an important meeting without one. Turning back to him, she sighed. "If you don't mind, I think I'm going to hit the bathroom real quick," she said with a sigh, moving to stand. She received only a nod in reply, the detective picking up one of his sizzling, greasy treats and popping it into his muzzle with a dangerous snap. Stepping away from the bar, Mocha slipped past the tables and toward the neon sign displaying a cowgirl over an old blackwood door. Pushing her way into the bathroom, Cha didn't even notice the heavy perfume in the room or the fluorescent lighting. She was far too in her own head to actually pay attention to her surroundings. Leaning on the counter, her palms resting on the cold, hard rim of the sink as she tried to straighten out her mind. Who was this witness with information on the origin of the ignition? How did they know her? And why were they so desperate to get in contact with her now? How did they think she could help them more than the police? The onslaught of questions in her head only intensified as she tried to get a hold on what was going on. Turning on the cold water, she splashed herself, slapping her cheeks as she tried to get her fevered mind under control. With the frigid tap water running down her puffy cheeks, she took a moment and looked at herself. Contacts made her look a bit less young, something she had difficulty with in bars when she was as short as she was. She'd had her ID scrutinized and back-checked on a number of times already in her adult life, but she still felt weird without her glasses on. The woman staring back at her was an adorable redhead with big, baby blue eyes that had long, dark lashes. She had a pronounced pair of beauty marks, little matching discolorations under her eyes that a few friends insisted she painted on. A cute little button nose sat above a cupid's bow that pouted into a plump lower lip over her slight, rounded chin. The expression on that pretty face wasn't one she liked, but she couldn't say she wasn't used to it. She was stressed. The nervous eye movements, her shaky grip on the sink, the tremble in her lower lip. She looked like a mess, and that wouldn't do. She was in front of a detective, being asked to do a job for a fabulous amount of money. She just needed to calm down, walk out there, and tell that handsome wolf that she would take his money and get the job done. The rest would sort itself out. Repeating that to herself inside of her head, she looked into her reflection's eyes and nodded. Standing up, she hugged her own slender frame, rubbing her sides. Then she bounced from one foot to the other, her sneakers squeaking on the tile as she got herself psyched back up. "I've got this. No worries. This is just another gig," she said to herself in her head. Reaching up, she gave each of her rosy cheeks another slap before reaching over to the paper towel dispenser and pulling out a sheet to dab her face dry. Once she was done cleaning up, she stepped back out into the bar, feeling refreshed and a bit more prepared to give this potential payday a chance. Slipping past tables and back to the bar, she found the detective still munching, his stout half gone as he enjoyed his evening. The detective seemed like a simple, honest man to her, something that worried her, given his job description, but she sat back down all the same.
"Welcome back,"
he said after swallowing, giving her a smile.
"Made your decision?"
"Where do I sign?" she asked, delivering a confident smirk of her own, her brow raising as he pulled out a black orb, the size of a jumbo marble. Holding it toward her, he indicated a subtle depression that she would have taken for a base.
"Biometric sig. It's private, and we won't put the sample on record. It'll simply be used as a reference if we have to go to court over the contract,"
he explained, answering her questions before she could ask them. Hesitating a moment longer, she reached forward, pressing her index finger to the depression. There were a series of pinpricks on her fingertip, and then a soft series of beeps. The black orb turned red and hissed. Then Detective Molnar pulled it away, stowing it in his pocket.
"The money will hit your account within 15 minutes of your departure from here. We'll be contacting you through the email you supplied us to update you on a pickup location and time. Times are non-negotiable and absolute. Be there, or you will find yourself in violation of our contract,"
he rattled off, relaxing and settling in to enjoy the rest of his potatoes. As far as his demeanor spoke alongside his tone, the conversation was over. Rather than sticking around, Mocha picked up and swigged the rest of her original mojito, tapping the bar and turning to leave. At the end of the bar, she slipped on a lengthy white coat, the tails swinging with a defined weight as she covered herself. Cinching the fabric tight around her waist as she headed for the door, she sashayed out into the night, though the night she stepped into was anything but dark. The streets of Neo-Denver were bright, the neon and fluorescent signs keeping the blue pavement of Colfax visible. The marble walkways were littered with socializing couples and thruples. The night is for lovers," Mocha chuckled to herself, slipping out of the way of a group of elves as they strode down the path without a care in their minds, smoke trailing after them as they indulged in their chemical escapes. Mocha gave them a good few seconds' head start before following them down the road. Much as she supported people finding and embracing their own relief, she didn't particularly care for the smell. Her heels clicked over the marble as she carried herself easily towards the Broadway strip, where she'd managed to secure her shop. She figured she would have to stop in and have a long talk with her employees about what to do in her absence over the next few months. As she walked, she was passed by countless vehicles of countless makes, kids and adults alike out to party in the streets of Neo-Denver. Electric bikes and peds, classic gas-powered pickups and cars, diesel trucks and buses, all passed her by as she wandered her way back down the main road and took a left at the far corner. As she made her way across the street, she noticed a very familiar horned man waiting for her at the light, his muscular frame leaning against the large aluminum structure. She didn't slow, continuing at an even pace, trying to move past Tabernis without acknowledging his obvious waiting for her. As she passed, however, he took her forearm, his hand far too large to simply take her own, and guided her around into a walk that continued down Colfax towards Broadway. "Hey!" Mocha started, reaching for her coat's secret pocket with her free hand, but a sharp noise from Tab cut off her protests and made her flinch, some almost forgotten part of her psyche surging back to life as the devil seized control of the situation. He caught her gaze again, vibrant blue meeting verdant green as the pair looked into one another again. The heat there, the desire that Tab pushed on her with his very being, it was intoxicating.
Shush, Cha. We're going for a walk. I'm gonna talk, and this time you're gonna listen,
he growled, his voice like the rumbling of the earth as he guided her away from her shop, her destination. His grip on her arm was tight, almost numbing as he walked her down the road with him, mean-mugging anyone who gave them a curious glance. It was the faces of passerbys that brought her back to herself, their worried gazes prying her from her own haze. Yanking her arm away from Tab, she turned to him, stepping back when she saw that dangerous look in his eye. "Fine, Tab. We'll talk. You can get it out, and then I'm going. I'm on my way home from a long day," she said, her hand now firmly in that pocket. Tabernis didn't know what she had hidden there. He'd never cared enough to find out how serious she was about her business. She was just sex for him, his little love toy Cha back then. Not anymore. He glared for a moment longer before he nodded, gesturing to the street, wanting to talk as they walked, as far as she could tell. Mocha followed his gesture, stepping ahead of him so that he could talk. With their size difference, he had never been able to walk next to her, so he would keep her in front of him so as not to lose pace with her. It was their habit.
"Look, Cha, I get it. I wasn't the best guy for you when we were together,"
he said, his voice washing over her as the two strolled down the marbled pavement.
"I was selfish with you and not thinking about what you needed. Just what I wanted from you. But you made me so happy. You made me feel powerful. You gave me something and I wanted more of it. I still want more of it. I was a wreck when you left. For months I was nuts over you."
Mocha listened actively, nodding that she understood when he paused, and keeping a steady pace so he wouldn't have to slow down for her.
"I went back to the gym. I put my mind on work. Everything. Anything to get you out of my head. I don't even know how many times I called your number,"
he continued, his pace slowing. She matched him, lost in his story. It made her feel bad, regardless of the fact that he had hurt her, regardless of the times he had stepped out with some floozy or another, leaving her alone, regardless of the bruises he'd left on her body for weeks after he'd flown into a rage. She felt bad for hurting him.
But nothing worked, Cha. Every time I looked around my old apartment, I saw you. Food lost its taste, time seemed to drag and then speed up. Everything was gray without you. The only solace was sleep. At least I could have you in my dreams,
he said, his footsteps slowing even further.
Everything else was hollow, cold. I even tried finding some other girls, someone to fill that hole you left. It did nothing. Women did nothing. Alcohol does nothing. Working out does nothing.
His voice rose in volume and intensity, his frustration, his agony, evident in every word as the pair of them ended up near an alley crossing that bordered a parking garage. Mocha turned to look at him to respond, yet as she turned, he reached out and put a hand on her. She paused, both of them standing in what was an increasingly empty part of the road.
You took something from me, Cha. When you left, you took what was mine,
he said, his tone almost a growl. Before she could draw, his grip tightened, and he pulled her smoothly to the side, into an alleyway. Mocha's eyes widened as she realized what was going on instantly. The story, the walk, his placement as he waited for her, everything had been planned. It had all been a trap to get her alone, in a position where he could corner her. She gripped the handle of her gun, moving to draw before she felt her arm go slack, her mind going hazy as he backed her into the alley, his magic working its way through her body. Charm, as it was called, was a minor devil compulsion many of the race shared among one another. It removed aggressive thoughts from a person, forcing them to behave kindly. For someone like Cha, it was a weak enough effect that she could recognize that it was working on her body, but that didn't make it any less effective. Before she could properly shake the effect, he had her back against the wall of the alley, his body completely shielding hers from view, even as he held her by the throat. Mocha's heart pounded in her chest as she looked him in his glowing green eyes, seeing a spark of something dark and terrible behind the forest.
You are mine, Mocha. You belong to me. Your place is with me,
he said, his words soft now that their faces and bodies were so close.
And I'm going to prove it to your body, your mind, and your soul.
Mocha couldn't struggle as he moved in, couldn't properly fight back as Tab kissed her. The union was electric, his red lips on hers again, had her tingling from her fingertips to her toes. Heat surged between them as his lips parted and her eyes fluttered closed. She smelled him, the subtle scent of burning wood, tasted the salty bitterness of his sweat and coffee as he pressed his broad tongue into her mouth. Her own tongues met his, mingling again as he reintroduced himself to her body with a satisfied groan. It was like he was a starving refugee tasting his first bite of cooked food in months. What scared Mocha most about the situation, more than his hand on her throat or the free palm pressed firmly to her hip, was the fact that she moaned along with him. They had both been starving, and Mocha did not like the implication that maybe he had been right, that she wanted this. When their lips finally parted, she shivered, suddenly cold with the lack of his presence against her. Letting her eyes bat open, she was caught in his gaze again. The hunger she found there was terrifying, violent, and passionate. Leaning lower, he dipped forward and kissed her neck, his voice rumbling into her body.
I'm gonna let you go now, Mocha. You're gonna walk home and nowhere else on the way,
he said. The game was simple. He was ordering her. If she obeyed, he'd find a way to reward her. If she didn't, he'd... Mocha closed her eyes, stifling a gasp, as he nudged aside her coat and kissed lower on her neck, seeking out a sensitive place that they were both very familiar with on her body. Forcing her way past his charm left an almost lactic burn across her body, like she'd done explosive calisthenics, and it helped her pull away from that space in her mind that wanted him so badly. "You are going to let me go, Tab," Mocha repeated, finally slipping her hand free of her pocket, fingers wrapped tight around the handle of an ivory, long-barreled pistol that she pressed muzzle first to his midsection, her expression turning fierce. "Then I'm going to go to my shop, and anywhere else I damn well please." Her voice was a growl, though it was cute in comparison to Tab's own deep tones. He didn't flinch, didn't even let his smile falter as he looked into her eyes and pulled his hand away from her throat. His smile broadened as he looked down, noticing the weapon now rested against his navel.
"You can fight me for now, Cha, but I know you felt it in that kiss. I know you were ready to walk home for me. I know you, Cha, and you know that this isn't over."
"It is over, Tab," she hissed, keeping the muzzle firm to his navel and her arm steady. "Now leave, or I will put a peephole where your belly button used to be."
"You won't shoot me, Cha,"
he said confidently, even as he backed off, his smile widening further as he looked at her. His gaze was predatory and playful in a way that almost gave Cha pause. "She might not, but I definitely will, devil!" came a high, lilting voice from the mouth of the alley, followed by the heavy, telltale ka-chack of a pump-action sliding into service. Turning to look, both ex-lovers were shocked to see a tall, blonde, muscular woman with her hair tied back in tight braids, leveling one of Mocha's prototypes at her ex. "Now get moving!" Tab's smile faltered, his eyes gleaming dangerously for a moment as he flexed, seemingly wanting to fight it out. Yet he glanced back at Mocha, and his demeanor evened out again. Stepping further from her, he moved deeper into the alley, raising his hands. Mocha moved hurriedly towards her blonde friend, Jez, her barrel still aimed at her ex, until the pair stood next to one another. Once she was safe, she stowed her pistol and watched as Jez safetied and slung her shotty over her shoulder.
"Be seeing you, Cha,"
Tabernis called back after her as she turned to leave the alley and head back to her shop. She didn't look back, didn't talk back. She didn't want to fall into more manipulations. She just walked away. "I should just go back and paint the wall," Jez remarked, glaring in the direction of the alley for a moment before she stepped in and wrapped an arm around Mocha, guiding her friend away from that scene. Jezzy led Mocha back to her shop in silence, holding her hand tight and looking back to check that they weren't being followed. Only when they were in front of the display window, the neon open sign blazing above them, did she stop to talk, her eyes running over Mocha. "Damn, girl, you're a mess," she sighed, brushing her hair away from her face, spying her smudged lipstick, the pink skin turning to hickeys along her neck. She fussed over her friend like a mother would a daughter. If not for their different hair colors and obvious racial features of the Amazon woman, their size difference would have reasonably justified that assumption. "What happened, girl? I thought you were cold turkey on men. Who the hell was that guy?" Mocha looked up at Jez, sighing as her best friend for the last year treated her like she was some 13-year-old child. She couldn't help but pout a little as she pushed the taller woman's hand away from her cheek. "That was my ex," she explained, "and it's a long story. I am cold turkey on men, women too for that matter, so ease off on the touching, please." "Sure didn't seem like you were cold turkey to me," she commented, not dropping the subject or yielding space. She cleaned off the excess lipstick with a thumb, brushing the hair out of Mocha's face for long enough to work away some eyeliner as well. "I was in half a mind to leave you with him, the way you two were kissing." Mocha went crimson in the cheeks as Jez confirmed that they had seen the whole thing. Reaching up, she pushed away Jez's hands, audibly protesting. "Look, he kissed me, not the other way around." "It looked to me like you let him." "Well, then you need glasses worse than I do," Mocha huffed.
How'd you know to follow us anyway? I didn't see you when I was walking. Yeah, you wouldn't have. You had a 300-pound brute blocking your vision. I was coming out of the store when he grabbed you. Followed both of you down the road, Jez explained, waving into the counter girl, Lisa. Coming out of the store? Mocha asked, curious. Yeah, I just got back from the wilds. Wanted to see if you'd made some adjustments on Barb for me. Maybe hook me up with some custom slugs? She giggled, her smile turning devious. Jez had been a danger to the local Muta populace just outside of Neo-Denver for something close to 2.5 years now. The woman was a devil with a shotgun and a true fighter. There were few other people Mocha would want at her back during a fight. Oh, sure. The slugs will be the usual price. As for the upgrades, old Barb was due for a tune-up last year, so her barrel probably needs a look, some cleaning, and probably a reinforcement. We could upgrade her shot weight and maybe beef her up a little, Mocha said, happy to be talking about guns rather than her love life. Guns were what she did. They were her first language in this techno-babble, mana-saturated wasteland. A way to say, don't fuck with me, to any big bastards who got the wrong idea. Holding out her hand, she waited for Jez to hand her the weapon so she could give it a good look, the pair of them preparing to walk into the shop. Jez took a moment to look Mocha over before unslinging her shotty and proffering the mighty weapon to the smaller woman. Barb was a piece of art, old as she was, and for 2 years of heavy use, she was in excellent shape, with only a few superficial scratches on her white twin barrels and their Magni Projectorate filament barrel coating. The mag tube was unblemished and pristine, capable of holding 10 shells, with a custom 2 full reload mag reloader. With the 2 shells she knew Jez liked to keep in the chambers, she and Barb could offload 30 rounds in a fight. Mocha pitied the man on the other side of that confrontation. The shotgun sported 2 21-inch barrels that would have to be reinforced and retooled. Her pump action would have to be oiled and sanded, and the grip replaced for function. Her triggers, both of them looked fine, but Mocha would double-check them anyway for slip or stick. She'd also need to swap, oil, and brush the beast before giving the weapon back to its owner. As she thought about these things, she and Jez moved into the shop, the redhead already prepared to get to work. Sencha woke up, her ears ringing and her head throbbing in incessant pain. It was a labor to think, much less move in the cramped, damned space. Everything was screaming, searing hurt. The moments where she managed to breathe in enough to scream were terrible, because her scream came up bubbly and wet, tasting like iron. When she finally managed to force her eyes open, she found herself in a lit structure, large machinery droning loudly enough to worsen her headache. The walls were made of a sleek black material, seemingly lined with holographic projectors that emitted soft orange light. With that light, she could see that she had landed on a large panel with several buttons, knobs, and monitors, most of which had been smashed by her body in the fall. The blood mattering the top of the panel was enough to tell her she hadn't fallen lightly. Looking around as best she could with her chest burning and her bones screaming at her to stay still, to die, she struggled to find more details. She could tell that the room itself was built underground. She'd likely come through the roof. She could see the rubble around her and scattered papers strewn on the soil on the floor. She could also see that her front right leg had been blown off. The sight alone would have had her hyperventilating if she could breathe properly to begin with. She had been shot plenty of times before, and it had caused her to panic, but now all she felt was despair. Whatever joke of a god that had control over her life has seen fit to let her wake up so she could watch herself bleed out and die. Her vision blurred, eyes wet with tears. Even as it hurt to sob, she did so anyway. This was her end, stuck underground in some bullshit laboratory under Dunning, little bits of her only friend scattered around her. Thinking about that only made it worse. Faz. Poor fucking Faz hadn't made it. He died pissed at her,
probably ready to tell her to fuck off for being inconsiderate and a terrible friend. She hadn't considered him, hadn't even thought about how her leaving might have made him feel. Now he was dead. She could see his arms across the room, other chunks of him here and there. She couldn't make this up to him. He couldn't go home or smoke his shitty, overexpensive cigarettes. The thought hurt her more than she thought losing a coworker ever could. Her vision blurred further, misery claiming her thoughts as the despair only worsened. She hadn't made it either, no chance of making it out of Dunning, no chance for a better life. Her leg was gone. Even if she didn't bleed out, she'd never make it anywhere missing a leg. There would be no journey in the wilds, no trip to the west to find herself, no chance of finding that special little redhead either. That thought broke her heart. No chance of seeing her again and having the life she hoped they would. She'd never see her beautiful face, or her twinkling eyes, or hear her sweet voice. "Dying sucks," she managed in a half-sob. She was so tired. Everything was so heavy. She was so very cold. The world was closing in, fading away. And yet, she didn't die. For what seemed like an eternity, she simply didn't die. For so long, she hoped that the gods would stop fucking with her and get it over with and stop that damned beeping. Wait, beeping? Looking over to the monitors, she looked for something, any indication of what the hell was happening to her. What she saw was seared into her mind as the walls around the panel began to shift, mechanical manipulators revealing themselves and moving forth from the dark beyond. Project RE Evolve. Feel evolution process commencing. Subject saturation 23%. Sentia snapped awake, looking around herself in a room that was much less technologically advanced than the one she'd just been remembering in her dreams. Checking her chest, then her abs for wounds, she finally sighed in relief when her hands brushed against the smooth, black, plated steel of her thigh. Glancing around the room, she found herself in a plain, small holding apartment in Neo-Denver, just on the outskirts of town. Rather than a control panel, she rested on a cramped, tidy little couch from a large concrete furnishing enclosure that was built so sturdily it had withstood the ignition, and the near century following it. Some things from the old world were built to last. The room itself had bare walls, a basic kitchen with a stove, refrigerator, and a little counter space beside the half-sink. For an orc or elf, it would have been small, but livable. For Sentia, it was hardly tolerable. She'd been in the space for less than a day while the PD checked her readings and the samples of information she had given them to measure the worth of her find. She knew they'd come back quick and give her exactly what she wanted soon enough, and that knowledge was the only thing keeping her from tearing the tiny holding apart. Sighing, she spread her arms, stretching her human torso, her ribs and spine popping as she yawned and wriggled away the remainder of her weariness. Her long black hair cascaded across her shoulders and back as she moved her upper body, tickling her lower back as the sports bra girding her ribs and chest groaned with the strain. She would regret sleeping in the damned thing later, she knew it. Once she felt limber and a bit more awake in her upper body, with some effort she stood, keeping her torso low to stretch her lower body. Bending forward, Sentia swung her head to the side to keep her hair out of the way and hugged her chest as she bent. She watched as her body moved on its two new mechanical legs, still fascinated by the limbs. In the attack where Sentia had been crippled by whomever had dropped her into that reactor room, she had lost her front right leg and rear left leg. Both had been replaced in the RE Evolve process she just so vividly remembered in her sleep. As she had been flooded with energy, which she now knew was mana, that power had reconstructed both limbs. Now she stood on metal legs, each gliding and shifting silently as she moved through her stretches, steel hooves clacking against the floor. For a few long minutes she stretched out, just taking in her own body and the fact that she was, indeed, alive. Then she swung herself into a low stand so as not to dome herself on the ceiling and headed to the bathroom. Even crouching how she was, her ears brushed the textured tiling the cheap manufacturer used to do the ceiling. The pain of being tall. It only got worse when she made her way to the threshold into the bathroom, where she had to bend her torso forward and wriggle herself lengthwise to get in. While bathrooms and tubs had been adjusted to meet the universal standards in most cities and were now much larger, housing units were something of a wild card. If they had been built before multi-petal races were widespread, there was a likelihood they were like the room she just stepped in from. The contrast of the bathroom itself from the door inward was almost comical, though. The room was spacious, likely larger than the living area, with a proper tub and a relief stall, along with a wide countertop sink and a large mirror. It was even slightly taller, much to Sencha's relief. She'd never admit it to the detective guy they sent to talk with her, but she'd actually spent more time in there than the rest of the place, just for the sake of comfort. Looking into the mirror, she took another good look at herself. With her hair off to one side, she could clearly see her thin, long brows and her own fierce, slanted eyes which, once a comforting chocolate brown, now glowed a neon pink. She had angular features, high cheeks, and tight, thin lips that pressed into a neat cupid's bow. Not quite what she'd call the pinnacle of feminine beauty. Her face had a long white scar, from her chin up to just below her right eye. It gave her a rugged, dangerous quality in her opinion, but she hated that it marred her visage. Sighing and looking down at herself, she took her long, slender fingers and rubbed at the back of her neck as she continued her observation. The muscles in her shoulder flexed with the motion, her scarred arm shifting with the motion. Past her breasts, a pride point for her, heavy as the girls were, she saw her waist, tight and trim. The flare of white scar tissue where she'd been shot during her mission to kill Valinov was still sensitive. Her abs flexed as she took another deep breath and then ran her hands down her front, over the broad chest muscles of her lower body, careful to miss her sex as she passed. The wall of musculature that controlled, protected, and cradled her second heart, secondary nervous center, and various other vitals was dense. Her fingers, strong as they were, weren't able to work into the muscles without extreme difficulty. When she found time to get massages and actually help relax the area, she found that the complex network of muscles still never really stayed relaxed for long. There was always a tension there, a stress. "At least the ladies like strength. I've got that," she said, turning to look lower. Her soft brown fur and her trim barrel were something she'd personally found beautiful about herself. But she had an inkling that the multiple legs and her extra backing were likely a reason she had very poor luck with women. "Do you like strong women, little sister?" she asked, done with her reflection, her gaze instead settling onto the counter next to the sink. Lying there, just far enough to remain clear of any splashing water, she'd left an old, printed photo. The picture was at least 10 years old, and was worn at the edges from how long it had been held. It was a simple photo, taken from the angle of a parent looking down at two children who were hugged together, beaming up at the camera. On the left was a much younger version of herself. An 11-year-old Sencha smiled back up at her with pearly white teeth. Her hair had been much shorter back then, cut to short pigtails. Even at 11, she'd been around 6 feet tall, but her mother, who had taken the picture, had towered over them both. Sencha'd been a little, willowy thing, and to this day, comparing the twiggy mate to the woman she was now legitimately brought a smile to her face. But she wasn't looking at the picture to remember herself. She wasn't looking for herself in it. She was looking for her dearest childhood friend. She found her easily, wrapped tight in the arms of her younger self. The smaller girl was maybe 8 at the time the photo had been taken. She was slender, pretty even then, with vermilion locks like the tail feathers of a phoenix. In the photo, her big baby blue eyes twinkled with simple, innocent joy. She'd had a little pin in her hair to keep the messy tresses away from her face, which gave Sencha a clear view of the little dark discolored spots on her face next to her eyes and right beneath the corner of her pink lips. In the photo, Sencha was holding the girl up in a tight hug while the girl threw up a victory sign with her adorable little hand. The The pair of them had just won a kite race together, celebrating victory with a photo that Sentia couldn't possibly know she'd cling to for over a decade. Before Sentia could reminisce further, she heard a knock at the door, her ears flicking to the side. Putting the photo down, she ducked under the threshold and made her way to the door, opening it after a momentary check. Outside of the door, hands in his pockets and a tired, lackadaisical expression on his muzzle, was Detective Darren J. Molnar. The Lycan was a peculiar man. He seemed calmed and unflapped by most anything that happened during the day. He seemed a man of very few pleasures and pastimes.
Sentia, good to see you again. May I come in?
He asked. His tone was polite, even possibly bored. When she stepped aside to allow him in and closed the door behind him, his demeanor didn't shift in the least. He turned to face her and gestured for her to have a seat once he felt she'd had enough space, sitting across the living room from her in a smaller chair.
We checked the info you gave us,
he began, watching Sentia pull herself into the couch, his gaze steady. She simply looked at him, waiting for him to continue. Everything that you gave us that could be verified came back as true. What couldn't is also highly probable. He continued after a moment.
That being said, the information you gave us is completely invaluable to the department and to Neo Denver. And your requests, while peculiar, are not unreasonable.
Sentia perked up noticeably, the couch groaning beneath her as she shifted on it, nearly ready to burst out of the little thing with joy. She could feel in her bones that he was going to grant her wishes. He was going to give her the quiet, beautiful life she was longing for, with the little woman she'd been longing for. The words were on his lips. They just had to be.
From this moment until such time as you can be declared safe and no longer an information asset to Neo Denver, you are under the protection of the city and its governance. You are to be granted an annual stipend of no less than 50,000 credits, with room for bonus payment depending on the value of acquisitions made as a result of your actions or volunteered intelligence.
She listened with rapt attention, not for all of the silly shit he'd already said, but for the real kicker, the thing she'd asked for over all of that. When she saw him settle back into his seat as though he was done talking, her heart sank. Did they just give her everything else she'd asked for in consolation? Had Mocha refused? And the last? She asked, her hope fading fast. Please.
Oh yeah, we got your liaison. Mojate Basu has agreed to be your personal guard and companion, at least for the time that we have you under protection from the people you named in Dunning. After that, another contract will need to be negotiated,
he said, noticing the groaning of the couch under Sentia a little too late. The furniture piece fell apart with the shriek of nails being torn from wood as Sentia surged to her hooves, shouting in her excitement, only to promptly dome herself on the ceiling and crouch in sudden agony. Yeah, ow, fuck! As the detective watched her, bemused by her reaction, he shook his head, making a mental note to tell the department to cover the property damage when they settled things, and left. The Smith shop was bouncing, old pre-ignition music playing as Mocha worked to true Barb's new barrels. She bounced her hips to the beat of the song as she watched a thin shaving trail of steel fall free of the new barrel, the music guiding the pace of her movements as she swayed and bounced in place. She absolutely adored pre-ignition music and dance standards. There was something so novel about doing things the way people had decades earlier that really livened the experience. It was like maintaining a tradition. Not to mention, it was vulgar, something the little redhead had always enjoyed. There was something so alluring about taboo, so enticing about going against the grain. She liked it when older people caught wind of what she had going on in her headsets, the indignant faces and resentful scowls of people twice her age enjoying their life half as much. It made her spine tingle. Looking down at Barb, she checked the newly constructed, graduated trigger for the action. The over and under pump action design was complex and, in most situations, impractical, as a break action was a more accurate way of delivering shells. However, with the proper mana threading and some good engravings, which were Mocha's specialty, The shells would slide right into place so long as the array wasn't damaged. This made for a much smoother, quicker-to-use weapon than the break action would be, with less chances of shell fumbling during stressful situations. Mocha knew that the outskirts were nothing but stressful situations. With the calamity that had been the ignition, it was now commonplace that certain people with powers, and even entire races of people, were now resistant or even immune to conventional bullets. Those weren't even the worst of things, because wild animals souped up on mana roamed the outlands, warring, feasting, and terrorizing anything in sight. A calm stroll out along the outskirts of town could turn into a high-speed explosive pursuit and then into a full-on monster stampede within under a minute out there. It was a dangerous world now, and so she gave her friends and customers the best possible options for surviving. In return, she got herself a faithful customer base, which, in turn, meant a consistent income. Her trade nowadays was magic-enhanced weaponry. Enchanted guns, bullets packed with magic power to cast spells, bayonets and blades coated and set to resist and eat magic barriers were only a taste of what Mocha produced. And in a world where the average man could be crushed under the palm of some jackass with a mystic quirk parading about as a god, protection like what the redhead could offer was high in demand for anyone who could afford it. Mocha was happy to even out the playing field. Reaching over to the trigger, she was about to reservice the parts when she heard the telltale knock on her bulletproof drop plate, a sliding glass door at the top of the stairs that led into the main shop, which was likely closed. The door was meant not only to keep the sounds of the shop out of the main business, but to also act as a barrier should there be a break-in or larger-scale attack. The working girls all had the code to come in and lock the place down during an emergency. The knocking meant this wasn't an emergency, so Mocha took a moment to dance her way over to the comm and see just who was knocking on her door at this time of night. What she found had her smiling and shaking her head. On the other side of the comm, in front of the lit camera, was the chocolate-perfect face of her snow-white-clad play rival, Phalion. The dark-skinned woman had silver-white, wind-swept hair, down to the ivory side-swept lashes on her big, pale, yellow eyes. Her figure did nothing to hint of the unnatural strength she'd held in that toned body of hers, and the gun at her shoulder, one of Mocha's own make, served to further the illusion that she wasn't a physical powerhouse. Mocha knew better, though. She had been on the receiving end of displays of that strength and grace, and she was happy they were friends while in the city. Little doll, let me come in," she crooned, her almond eyes twinkling with amusement as she made her joke.
"Joke's on you, bitch. I don't have facial hair,"
Mocha chuckled, pressing the release button on the console next to the monitor where she viewed that entry camera. The bulletproof door hissed and then slid to the side, allowing her friend down and into the shop.
"Or body hair, for that matter," she called up to Phalion, lowering the volume of her music as the woman entered her space. The click of Phalion's heels on the steel stairs stopped a moment after the door hissed back into place, and Mocha turned to face the stairs as she shut off the lathe. The woman was stripping out of her silver heels, her white pants and top clinging to her curves. "Oh, I'm well aware of how bare your tender skin is, little doll," she growled back, walking silently the rest of the way down the stairs. "I heard from the girls upstairs that you were stepping away from the shop to take up some contract work." Mocha sighed and nodded at that. "I am. Might be gone for the better part of a year," the petite woman confirmed, pulling over a pair of rolling chairs and kicking one over to Phalion. As the chair rolled across the space, she seated herself and waited to see why the woman was asking. The shifter woman didn't seem pleased, even as she stopped the stool with her foot. Kicking it to the side, she stepped past it and closed in quickly on Mocha. Straddling her, the taller woman looked down at her, her expression judgmental. "And I am supposed to entertain myself how?" she growled, a scowl on her face that could make an orc snarl look like an elvish smile. Her nose wrinkled as she apparently caught the scent of something rank, looking around for its source. "Not my problem, Fluffy," Mocha teased, shrugging both shoulders. "I am not your personal punching bag."
She peeked past her glasses to find Phalion glaring daggers at her.
Oh, come on. There has to be someone in the wilds as fun to shoot at as I am.
There is not, and you know this. It is why I agreed not to hunt you down in the city. It is why your weapon sits on my back. Do relationships mean nothing to you? She growled, heat flowing off her beautiful body as her rage built. She sniffed again, eyeing Mocha as she locked in on the source of the smell.
Maybe they would if they weren't so weird,
Mocha said, her tone turning indignant as she looked up into those pale yellow eyes with her baby blues.
I don't know if a friends in town, enemies outside of it agreement is even actually a relationship, Mrs. Enforcer, she continued, bringing up their agreement again. It's more than that, little doll. I have claimed your head. Claimed my head, yes, I know.
Mocha cut her off before she could go on to her tirade, only to squeak in discomfort as her hair was grabbed and her head yanked to the side.
Oh, hey!
She struggled in vain as Phalion held her neck craned and leaned in, sniffing her nape. Who is this? Whose stench is on you? The shifter demanded, growling. The intensity of her displeasure was such that it made genuine panic rise in Mocha's chest.
The fuck is it with people manhandling me tonight?
The redhead asked, placing a hand to Phalion to vie for some space. Standing up and pushing the shifter back before walking back over to the lathe, she tried to collect her thoughts. She could feel Phalion moving after her as she stepped away. The shifter wasn't happy, and Mocha would answer for it, or there would be hell to pay.
The person you smell on me is my ex-boyfriend, Phalion. He thought it would be a good idea to corner me in an alley tonight.
And he is dead? The taller woman growled expectantly, a quality Mocha couldn't quite put her finger on in her voice. She was calmer now, something gentle brushing down Mocha's neck and shoulder as she leaned against the lathe. Phalion's warm breath ran down her nape as the woman cleaned her with what seemed like a handkerchief.
No,
she asked more than said, turning to look at Phalion. Long, slender fingers slipped back under her chin, cupping it and guiding Mocha. I will fix that, then, she assured Mocha quietly, backing the redhead up until she felt her ass press into the machine. Her hand guided the silk sash over Mocha's skin, the firm pressure encouraging circulation as Phalion cleaned her around the neck, stroking away the lingering discomfort she felt from her time with her ex earlier in the evening. The smaller woman struggled not to lean into the touch. I will clean you up, and when I leave here, he will learn that he is not allowed near you, not allowed to put his stench here. I'll take his spine.
Whoa, whoa, whoa!
Mocha tried to protest, working a hand between her and the shifter as her eyes widened at the severe punishment that had just been proposed.
It's fine, Phalion. Sheesh. We already chased him off. He didn't do anything serious.
Nothing serious? You are bruised, little doll, she said, cupping Mocha's cheek. Show me, she said, her voice demanding as her presence, but gentle. Mocha found herself leaning into that slender palm, the gentle touch calling to her. She exposed her neck, showing where Tab's grip on her skin had caused it to darken. There was a distinct mark near the little notch behind her collar, where his lips had caught her while he tried to reach the special spot. He tried to mark you, she said, literally bristling with fury. With a practiced touch, she began to massage at the ring formation around Mocha's neck, stroking and pressing it in ways that had the smaller woman seeing stars. Phalion was a master in the physical arts, to be sure, but she was secretly also great at giving massages. It wasn't until half a minute later, when her knees started wobbling, that Mocha's brain caught up with what had been happening to her.
Yeah, but it's not like he's never done anything more egregious to me,
Mocha mumbled, not sure what to say to calm Phalian down, with her head all foggy again. It was hard to look her in the eyes, with how intensely she was staring. Mocha only managed to meet that pale yellow gaze after she felt Phalian's hand settle on her hip, the cloth taken away from her neck and the hickey. Once again, Mocha found herself getting lost. "I did not just claim your head, little doll," the taller woman said, her eyes piercing into Mocha as the pair of them looked into one another. Lifting Mocha's free hand, she began running little pecks up her arm, the contact leaving Mocha tingling wherever her lips touched. "I claimed you. When you are ready again, I will take you. No slimy musclehead that smells of gym sweat may have you." Heat rose in Mocha's cheeks as she looked away, trying to escape that gaze, those feelings she'd been pushing down for an entire year.
"Phalian,
she started, but the shifter silenced her, placing a finger to her lips and shaking her head slightly. The protests died on her tongue. Mocha's hand fell on a wide hip and pulled the woman close again as the kisses up her arm and across a small, round shoulder closed in on her sensitive neck. The redhead leaned into the lathe as Phalian's hot, powerful body pressed against hers. Their kisses were quiet, hungry, and passionate, punctuated by sharp, stuttering gasps as the shifter easily manipulated her body. When they finally broke apart, the petite gunsmith was panting as she looked at the woman who had just made her lose track of time and her location. Mocha didn't see a hunger that scared her in Phalian's eyes. She only saw playful joy, warmth, and passion. Phalian was dangerous like that. She made Mocha want to give in. "Good girl. All clean. Just don't let some burned wood-smelling asshole cut in front of me," she joked, giving Mocha's ass a firm pinch before stepping away and letting the smaller girl breathe.
Ouch!
Mocha protested, laughing with Phalian and trying to swat the other woman. If she was forced to admit it, that kiss had felt good, very good. But what made her more comfortable with it was that Phalian didn't seem to want to ignore her wish to be single. She felt something between them, but it was something she was not willing to explore right now. And that was okay. The gentle tone of the night shifted after Phalian left Mocha's shop. The warrior had maintained her smile and pleasant demeanor until the redhead had waggled her fingers and closed the door, turning and pressing her back to it in that cute way that smitten girls in movies did. Phalian would have wondered if the girl realized that the front door to the shop was see-through and that her cuteness was on full display if she didn't have the fires of hatred roiling in her chest. Turning away, she stalked the street with purpose, her aura turning the dark of the night cold as she passed. It was late, possibly early, but Phalian didn't care. She was full of rage, seething anger roiling in her chest. Some dead man had tried to take her little doll from her, tried to mark her, and left his filthy stench on her. It was unacceptable to the highest extent. No filth could touch what was hers, nor dare to mark the property of the northern gale. Taking a deep breath, Phalian retrained her thoughts, picking a destination. She would find the lout in time. For now, she wanted food, a drink, and a pop off someone's head. A bar could supply at least 2 of those things for her. The clack of her heels on the marble walk echoed as she turned onto the main road, heading to a local bar. While she lived on the other side of town, coming across the city to see Mocha was no big deal, especially when the girl planned on disappearing. Finding out that she was possibly leaving town also allowed for the possibility of another encounter in the wilds, something that Phalian was particularly hopeful for. It was a thrilling thought. Though, the fact that Mocha would willingly leave town for a gig made Phalian curious. The arms dealer hadn't risked another run-in with her in several months, content to focus on her craft instead of risking defeat. Phalian could attest to the quality of her work, it being the only firearm capable of keeping her at a pause. That quality was the reason she even deemed it appropriate to carry the weapon draped across her back. What could lure her back into the wilds? Who could pay enough to make such a thing tempting? Both were intriguing questions to Phalian, so much so that she found herself completely distracted when she entered the bar. It was a rowdy place, smelling of hot wings, cheap liquor, and cheaper cologne. Locals in the area were known to rough it, and the gangs in the city claimed turf in the area, mainly to further the illusion of power. So they liked to pile up in bars on late nights like these to show off and impress new hires with their clout and authority. Tonight just happened to be the wrong night to show it off. As Phalian stepped into the siren's call, anyone who was anyone shut the hell up, watching the dangerous woman strut with the confidence of a god towards the bar. Everyone got the message not to stand in her way, moving with a quickness so as not to bump into her. Everyone except Ricky. Ricky was relatively new on the block, one of the freshest members of the Razorbacks. He was large for the bipedal races, a solid 7'3" with a tight, athletic fighter's build and a charming smile. Tiger folk like him were known to be excellent fighters and dangerous warriors, rare as they were. He had made quite the name for himself during initiation with those very skills. Now the young, spry tiger man nudged one of his fellow gang members, looking round to make sure all eyes would be on him for his next impressive showing. Standing and puffing out his barrel chest, he walked towards her, obviously intending to bowl her over or at least make her move out of his way. Instead, when he crossed into her personal space, tensing up for a collision, there was a loud, dull, wet crunch. To everyone else in the bar, it looked like he walked close to her and then just fell backwards into the side, holding his face. To his friends at the bar, one saw her hand blur away from her side and then across his lower face. To Ricky, there was nothing but blinding agony for a second as he tumbled to the side, holding his jaw. When he pulled his hand away, a deluge of blood and half of his beautiful, pearly teeth came with it. The tiger man screamed in dismay, turning on the woman as he forced his way to his feet to see her walking away, still distracted. Rage overwhelmed him, and he drew his piece, a Magitech Wesson & Cochran Magnum, aiming at her side. He pulled the trigger, the blowback on the handgun enough to make his powerful arm numb as he sent death to avenge his face. Phalian turned with a casual backhand, sending the high-powered, overpacked round off to bore a hole through the dartboard. With her eyes locked on him, the entire room went chilly and dead quiet. Shots had been fired. "You want to fight me, weakling?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous as she stepped toward the tiger, who shrieked in fearful disbelief. Taking aim at her again, he fired once more, only for her to slap his second shot away as casually as the first. "You dare to challenge me with your shitty physique and your measly, feeble body? Then have the fucking nerve to attack me with some trash weapon for dogs? I've never seen a pistol so fucking tiny," she said, slapping the weapon from his hand in pieces. The force of the blow dragged him to the floor as though she'd taken him and thrown him. Comical and impossible as the sight was, the denizens of the bar only watched as the man tried to right himself. The pitch and tone of the scream he made when her foot shattered the wood board directly next to his groin was so high, his commander thought she'd actually smashed the poor cat's jewels. He stared up at her and cowered, tail coiled around his leg and his ears pinned back. Her presence alone was enough to break the rowdy, foolish young gangster, but breaking him wasn't enough for her, it seemed. He yelped as the woman kicked him onto his back, then stepped onto his abs, walking on him purposefully as she made her approach to the counter, where 3 lemon drops awaited her. She picked one up, downing it in a swig before nodding to the tender. 3 more of these," she growled, slipping her Calipigian rump onto a stool and picking up her second. "And someone pick up the damned doormat." So it was that the newly initiated and highly celebrated Ricky was tossed to the wayside, only a few friends left with him to make sure he was okay. Back inside of the bar, Doormat had already been forgotten by Phalion, who had drowned her fourth shot and was still contemplating murder. The insults and curses on her tongue were meant for another man, a man she'd yet to meet. So instead, she waited for food while she mentally calmed herself with the sound of cracking walnuts. It wasn't until she downed her fifth sour that she recognized that someone was addressing her. Turning back her ears, she listened in. The voice was deep, confident, and directed at her. It wasn't common for her to receive direct requests, so she paid attention.
"Enforcer? Lady Enforcer?"
came the voice of a male, probably serpentine or reptilian in nature, judging by the resonance of his voice and his distinct, almost hissed S. Sighing, Phalion turned, easing her scowl as she addressed the newcomer. It was bad business to scare away work, even if it was funny. "That'd be me. What is it?" she asked, looking the man over once before deciding that he genuinely was here to pay her for something. He had a familiar scent to him, one that the silver-haired enforcer associated with cowards and cheaters. He was, as she had guessed, a long serpentine creature, one of the more colloquial named Naga. They were rare in this part of the world, as their long bodies signified long life, and with that long life came wealth. While Neo Denver was a beautiful, powerful city, it did not lend itself to being a great vacation place for the exorbitantly wealthy, not unless it was some Yorkie purchasing property on the east side. Neo Denver was a place of action, a city fraught with mercenaries, businesses, and trade. For someone with money like the man in front of her, she would expect Neo Denver to be a place of business, not one for relaxation. He didn't look human enough to be one of the York Prefecture elite. As for the man himself, he was about 40 feet in length, large, with a cobra's hood and lime green scales. He had 4 arms, both pairs ringing one another as he prepared to talk through his serpentine, noseless face. While not exactly hard on the eyes, Phalion wouldn't have called the slimy reptile anything but pleasant otherwise. His humanoid torso was lean, indicating a good metabolism, or perhaps a personal health regimen. But his arms were stringy, and it seemed to Phalion that his most experienced body part was his mouth.
"I have heard you are the most powerful fighter in the city,"
he led, putting the supposition forward, as if it would flatter her into taking some kind of discount. When she said nothing, simply looking at him with her bored expression, he continued nervously.
"I had hoped we could do business after I have viewed a display of that prowess, to ensure I am investing in a worthwhile contract. You don't come cheap."
The serpent blabbered. His statement piqued her interest, though, and so she perked up in her seat. The man had walked up to her and asked her to show him her strength. That meant he was either daft, inexperienced in the field of mercenaries, or trying to insult her. She hadn't ruled out daft. He seemed the type to frequently talk himself into and out of large messes. But on the off chance that he did in fact want to insult her, she hadn't had a chance to really work off some steam in weeks, and the Naga were known for being durable and regenerating. Instead of asking him directly, she chose to test the water and see how he behaved. "Before I agree to show you anything, what is the job? I don't tolerate wastes of my time," she growled, her tail swaying languidly from side to side as she stared into the man. Her pale yellow eyes bore into his soul, and she could tell he felt uncomfortable, though he managed to maintain eye contact.
"I have enemies who would like to hunt me down, so I've come to Neo Denver,"
the man explained, seemingly unperturbed that the entire bar was listening to them. It was likely that if she rejected him here, the entire town would hear of it. His life would be over if that were the case, which was why clients normally made appointments to speak in private, so no one knew who would or wouldn't protect them. This told Phalion that he had enough money set aside that he thought she likely couldn't refuse, or thought he had something so juicy to offer she'd simply take the deal up front. That prospect also intrigued her, and so she listened as he continued talking, his eyes locked on her body, though they roamed freely down her chest and waist to her hips, then back up her body.
"I doubt you are familiar with the Black Cats. They're a local mafia group at the heart of operations in Dunning. I need the people they're sending here or smuggling into the city at night to be taken care of. I'm willing to pay 15 large per every confirmed head,"
he said, laying out his money and his intentions for her, or at least that's what he was willing to divulge at the moment. 15 large wasn't cheap, especially per head when the negotiation was for the extermination of mafia goons. It was enough to make even a city enforcer look twice. If he was good for the money, this man was wealthy beyond imagining. Wealthy in the kind of way that screamed pre-ignition wealth. It was then that Falion concluded that this man was an idiot. Falion smiled to herself. She wasn't above dipping her hands into the overflowing coffers of antiquity. Quite the opposite. Standing, she let her ears flick as she stood and set her gun to the side, the beautiful pale rifle leaning against the counter. 3 more, Tender, on this one, she said as she scanned the room for her target. It's a large per man of yours I take care of for this little test of yours, she informed the serpent man, noting that he seemed not to even flinch at the amount of money she was about to make him spend just for a show of power.
"Any price bumps for supers?"
the man asked, seemingly genuinely curious. "No, it's a flat rate," Falion said. Regardless of what kind of person he brought forward in her city, she would not be found lacking in a contest of strength or skill. Though, I will inform you now, before I trash your men, city law dictates I don't do business inside of the city. No mercenary will unless they want their head on my plate. This is a show, personal and off-duty. Whatever thugs you want taken care of will be caught and dealt with in the wilds." She spoke simply. Hers was the law of the city, not the law of the people. The very magic that held the walls and forced back the beasts of the wild was behind her and within her.
"I suppose I really am getting my money's worth, then,"
the man smiled, pulling a blank card from his purse and smiling, moving past Falion to place it on the counter next to her new drinks. Turning with a confidence and poise only granted by generations of guidance and decadence, he began moving to the door.
"Shall we step outside for the moment?"
Falion followed, leaving her weapon, her drinks, and the man's money behind. No one would dare touch what was hers, and she knew it. Letting the serpent man out into the night before her, Falion stepped out after him, only to feel something speeding toward her head the instant her heel hit the walk. Lifting a hand, she guided the soup's wrist, forcing the punch off course and sending the man off balance in front of her. With the momentum he'd put behind the blow, he sailed in front of her, only to be caught by her free hand, her nails pressing into his throat around his trachea. With him caught, Falion took a glance at the speedster, recognizing him as an avian. He had a long neck and a hooked beak from below his pretty, big orange eyes. It explained why he had attacked so quickly from above her. His plumage was standard for the half-owls, a pretty caramel brown with snowy white countershading. His physique, along with his speed, would make him a significant mid-rank threat in the wilds, though the light weight and hollow bones would likely get him killed by anything actually tanky. The soup paused in her grasp, well aware just why she had grabbed him by the throat. She could smell the fear pour off the man, wafting through his feathers. It tainted his mana, made him sour. If she'd really wanted to enjoy taking his head, she would have done so before he felt her fingers. That way his mana wouldn't go bad before he died. "Do you want me to leave them alive?" she asked the snake man who was coiling himself on the sidewalk next to a large gold and black limousine.
"I'd prefer you let them live. Yes,"
he replied, his tone amused as he watched the speedster in her grip tremble in fear for his life. He gasped and grabbed his throat the second she released him, coughing as he rubbed the area. He didn't have long to relieve himself, as Falion pushed his chest with her palm, bullying him to the sidewalk where his boss was.
"Hey!"
he protested, trying to stop her, exerting his speed to try and swat her hand away as she pressed him on. She smirked and ignored him, batting away his feeble attempts to protect himself, smacking his hands hard enough to hurt him and make him wince when he tried to push her hand off of him. She kept on playing with him until he had backed up into the door of the limousine, trying to get away from her. She simply smiled at him like he was a plaything, a fun pastime, while she waited for the real show. Turning to a prospective employer, she maintained her devious smile. Cute. Where are the rest?
They're in the vehicle. I brought 5, including Jeffrey here,
the man said, looking with warning agitation at the man who was pressed against the door of the limo.
Let them out, Jeffrey.
Yeah, Jeff, let out the competition, Falion chuckled, slapping the man lightly on the cheek twice, just to prove a point. The man glared at her in fiery indignation before turning and yanking the door open. Falion stepped back, interested to see who all would exit the vehicle. The first 2 to exit were a pair of twins, humanoid and beautiful. They looked almost completely human, save for the lengthy, pointed ears and the scent of sap that soaked their very pores. Falion would have pegged both raven-haired sisters as elves long before she saw the fancy, enchanted wood swords the pair had at their hips. She openly rolled her eyes at them both. Some of the new races just went all out with the old stereotypes of pre-ignition fantasy. It really made her sick to her stomach how quickly weaklings conformed to old bullshit. Fucking elves. What's next? A dwarf with a big beard and a shirt that says "Toss me"? Falion asked, openly ignoring both of the twins, who gave her indignant stares before a female dwarf stepped out after them. Falion laughed openly that her guests had been so close, finding endless amusement in the fact that this troupe of supers had met the ideals of cliché so readily. "Oh, God, look! It has a little hammer!" she cackled as she held her midsection. The dwarven woman was about 4 foot tall, and did indeed have a heavy-looking gilded hammer. Her brown locks were in tight braids, and her light green eyes were striking as she looked around to her comrades before glaring at Falion. Apparently, she was a bit insecure about being called out for conforming to her own racial stereotypes. The shifter could openly feel the hate pouring off all 3 of them at the moment, but paid them no heed as she enjoyed the much-needed levity. She couldn't help but double over when the last super, a humanoid with a 3rd eye, stepped out of the car and stood proudly. "And a Triclops? What's his superpower? He can watch the other 3 lose at the same time?" The 3-eyed man was about 6 foot tall with pale skin and mostly human features. Human purists absolutely wouldn't accept him for his 3rd eye, but he was by all other standards a rather average-looking fit human. Not that his being so did him any favors in Falion's eyes. The ire of the entire group was on her now, and to be honest, Falion didn't care. She had made her easy money for the night. She'd beat these 5, finish her drinks, and be gone within the next 10 minutes, whether the Snake Man hired her or not. It was turning out to be a much better night than she'd anticipated.
The terms are as follows,
the Snake Man said, cutting into her laughter, though she only toned it back to amused chuckles rather than stopping.
You will beat each one of them 1-on-1, and if you can, I will issue a contract specifically for you under city law with the Mercenary Guild. It will be under the Valinov family name, very easy to recognize.
You sure you don't want to send them there all at once? Give 'em a chance? Falion asked, eyeing the troop of men and women with increasing amusement. She couldn't take any of them seriously, and when the speedster openly charged her again, she returned to her laughing, slapping both of his clawed arms aside before cracking him across the beak with the same hand, sending him sailing down the sidewalk with a howling cackle. The man whose name she'd already forgotten bounced once, then again before tumbling into a messy heap on the sidewalk. He groaned once, trying to push himself to his knees, before he simply collapsed, his body occasionally twitching in place. "That's one," she chided between amused chuckles. The Snake Man went slack-jawed as he looked down the street to his man, who had been neatly crumpled into a pile on the walkway in less than a second. The man obviously hadn't even been able to properly see the exchange. He stared in awe at her for a long moment before gesturing to his goons to get a move on. Both of the elves drew their blades, glancing at one another before advancing and moving to either side of Falion on the sidewalk. Doing so put one of them standing over the tail of their employer, which had her wobbling lightly as she wielded her stance more than she was used to. "Elves, so picky and needy," Phalion commented, sighing and taking a step away so that the girls could be on equal footing. Didn't want them complaining that she hadn't given them the space to move around with their pretty little swords. Both girls tried to follow her, but as they did, the one standing over the employer's tail tripped on it, stumbling off to the side as her balance abandoned her, and the noble hissed in discomfort. Phalion smirked openly at them both, even when the unoccupied twin went for a sneak attack, hoping to take off Phalion's head. The shifter flicked the flimsy wooden annoyance away, snapping the blade in half and sending the twig flying down the street. Turning to scold the silly elf for trying to attack her before both twins were ready, she found herself guffawing again as she found the raven-haired beauty looking between her and the ruined weapon, teary-eyed and speechless. "Oh, you can't be serious. She's gonna cry."
"No, I'm not!"
The elf shrieked at her, the elegant features of the elf turning a ruddy red that really just made her look like a tomato with fake ears on. It only became more amusing as tears began running down her cheeks. Her sister recovered her balance and moved in front of her twin as though she intended to protect her sister's honor from the big, bad wolf. They had such a quintessential twin-girl chemistry, Phalion thought they both might legitimately be synchronized in mana as well. So, naturally, Phalion broke her sword too, just to see if they would both have the same reaction. She was very pleased to find that they did. Whatever magical power they had seemed to be very invested in those two twigs they were trying to swing around, so when both broke, the women fell onto one another, sobbing. The shifter was about to comment on the comedic duo when she caught a whiff of something on the night air. Immediately her levity was quelled. The area around her became cold once again, the familiar stench of filth and burning wood. Without pause, Phalion turned away and started walking back to the bar to get her things.
"Where are you going?"
the Valinov man asked, obviously embarrassed of his help and confused. "We all see how this is going. I'm taking my things, and I'm moving on. I have something better to do," she said as she headed back into the building, her heels clicking on the marble. The people inside were all bustling and pushing to get away from the windows when she entered, the gangsters and the important folk moving back to their seats while trying to seem inconspicuous. No one got in her way as she walked up to the bar and slipped her rifle strap over her shoulder. She picked up the card and pocketed it as well, ignoring the fresh wings next to her 3 new drinks. She wouldn't be staying to enjoy them. Only when she heard the door into the bar slam did she even turn her ears back the way she came. She heard the dwarf charge her from behind, heard her bellow a mighty war cry. Just as the shorter woman reached the bar to bring down her hammer, Phalion stepped to the side, picking up the lemon drop that was in the way and downing it. The hammer came down where the drink had been, smashing through the bar and into the floor with the raw power the dwarf exuded. Unfortunately for the diminutive woman, by the time she yanked the hammer out of the floor and over her head for a follow-up strike, Phalion casually kicked her back the way she came, sending her flying through the door and out into the street with a squeaky wheeze. Phalion sighed as she lowered her leg. The weakling would have to learn not to get in the way of her betters the hard way. Phalion tapped the remainder of the counter and tossed a few creds onto the mostly splintered wood before turning and heading out of the broken door with not so much as another word. Stepping back out into the night and down the walk, she walked over the new dwarven doormat to the siren's call and made her way toward the snake man and his 3-eyed companion, who was bristling with rage. Unfortunately for him, Phalion couldn't be convinced to care how weak supers felt.
"You haven't beaten all 5 of them,"
the man protested half-heartedly as he loitered about next to his vehicle, apparently never having seen someone with real power before. The man next to him was fuming, looking ready to beat on his own chest like an ape. "Why?" she asked, looking around for anything more interesting. "If you want to test my skill, find someone worth my time," she shrugged, turning as she hit the sidewalk to follow the scent. It was stronger now, like the person leaking the stench was sweating. She could tell that he was nearby, maybe a block or two of the bar, the scent reminding her of her little doll in the worst of ways. She could see Mocha in her mind's eye, her neck bruised from where the asshat had touched her. She could feel that stench over her natural otherworldly sweetness, marring it, overshadowing it. The thought made her blood boil. Her attention was so focused on the scent of her prey that she was genuinely surprised when a hand landed on her shoulder, immense strength far beyond that of a normal human landing on her arm. She turned to look at him, her eye glinting with the rage she was feeling as she turned her own ire on him. The man was blown back by a concussive blast, his body ragdolling before slamming and embedding itself into the hood of the limo, setting off the horn into a long, loud wail. Brushing off her shoulder with a hand, the shifter walked off into the night to avenge her little doll. Tab growled into the crook of his nightly conquest's neck, nibbling on her as he calmed down. He'd managed to talk a pair of girls in the club into coming out with him for a walk before charming both. Things were so much easier when he used his power. No struggling, no screaming or protesting unless he wanted it. He indulged himself frequently now, seeking the highs of power he had once felt with his younger red-headed lover. She had submitted to his desires and whims with a devotion he hadn't found anywhere else. She had been willing to do things no other woman would even consider unless charmed. Even now in the alley, one of the two women standing dazed and still under his power while he ravaged her friend in front of her, he was still thinking about her. He saw Mocha everywhere. It ruined his highs. The memory of her blue eyes staring up at him brought him back to earth, where he found himself still unsatisfied, even as the blue-haired cat girl slumped to the ground against the brick wall of the alley. He huffed and punched the wall before slicking back his hair with a free hand, turning to the other girl. This one was the very reason he'd approached the pair in the first place. She had the same red hair as Mocha, though he suspected it was dyed. She was much taller and had a much more slender build rather than the petite pear shape of his ex. She was also not human, the ears parting her hair and her long-haired horsetail giving her way. No, she was not Mocha, but she'd do for tonight. Then he'd get his hands on Cha soon enough. He'd almost gotten her where he needed her tonight, if it weren't for that blonde bitch. Tab shook his head. This was no time to get frustrated. He needed to sate himself and then head home and think about his next move. Stepping away from the wall, he turned to face the horse girl and chuckled to himself. Maybe he'd release the charm on this one. Hearing the moans and protests might help. The air was thick with the stench of whatever scum had touched her little doll when Phalion rounded the side of the sated Sphinx nightclub. If the ex had been in the club, that explained why his scent was so potent and sweaty. The body heat and close proximity did that to people. It wasn't until she heard the, "No, stop! Let me go!" that Phalion spotted the man, though. Phalion was in action long before she processed the information, hopping the fence into the alley with ease and landing right behind the scum. The scene was horrible. The stench of devils, alcohol, and sex permeated the area, foul and disgusting. The tall, crimson-skinned male stood over a woman with red hair who was cowering away from him, glancing fearfully between his pelvis and an unconscious brunette who had collapsed onto the alley pavement, insensate. He was bulky, muscular, and intimidating the small woman into a bad position. Phalion's leg came down on his skull with a harsh crack, his horn snapping before her shin connected with bone. The man was instantly brought to his knees. His bellow of pain was loud enough to be heard across the street as he dug his fingers into the brick of the wall. His victim turned and ran, rushing to get away from him and whatever monster had struck him with so much force. If Phalion hadn't been livid, she'd have commended him on his legs not breaking under the force of her kick. Instead, she landed and slammed her shin into his side with a round kick, the force snapping his upper arm and sending him bouncing down the alley like a rag doll. His pained roar when he came to a stop was just as agonized as the first. His body was bleeding from the head and mouth, her kicks having devastated the devil. She marched toward him, the rifle slipping from her shoulder as she contemplated killing the man where he lay. Yet when her aura, the raw force of her power, manifested in the alley, the cold vacuum of infinity pressing into every nook of the tight space, she found the foul creature weeping and pissing himself in fear. She hadn't even leveled the barrel at his face before he passed out under her pressure. "Are you fucking serious? This weakling, who can't even withstand my intent, was with my—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, the thought was so frustrating. Looking down at the unconscious creature, she felt nothing but revilement and disgust. Well, she could have ended it there, killed the failed excuse for a man as he lay in his own excretions. She chose not to. He hadn't suffered nearly enough for her liking. Not yet. So it was that at 4 a.m. on a weeknight, an unconscious, critically wounded devil was turned into the Neo-Denver PD with a nice list of charges carved by a claw into his forehead.